Shilian was curious. Why can't I drink this? The queen reached for the small jade cup and took it from him. She poured a bit of its contents on her handkerchief and pressed it gently a few times on her face. Mount Tesang recently sent in a batch of fresh fruit. I don't like cherries, but there was a method of making it into a paste for facials, so I squeezed some for fun. There's not much use for it, and I was about to have it thrown out, so I can't possibly have you drink it. Shilian smiled as he listened, but suddenly recalled the events of the day before. There were very few times in a year where Mu Cheng's mother could taste cherries, and Mu Cheng himself would get bullied just for trying to pick some. It was something of a sensitive topic, and Shilian was afraid that Mu Cheng would be uncomfortable listening to it, so he smiled and changed the subject. Then, do you have anything that I could eat? The queen chuckled. The way you make it sound, others will think that I starve you. But you've been a picky eater ever since you were young. I can't plump you up. You've gotten so thin since you entered the mountain. Today, you'll eat whatever I tell you to. No fuss. Mother and son conversed for a while, and the queen asked about the incident during the heavenly procession, sounding quite concerned. By the Gorsha's report, it sounds serious. What's going to happen? Will you be punished? Shilian didn't have the chance to answer before Qi Rong cut in. Humph, that wasn't Cousin Crown Prince's fault. The one who fell off the wall wasn't him. If anyone must be punished, then it should be that little fiend. What little fiend? Shilian thought in annoyance. He hadn't corrected Qi Rong, but the queen laughed. Just then, she noticed the two outside the manor. Who's the child next to Feng Xin? It's the first time I've seen another person by your side. Shilian replied cheerfully. That's Mu Cheng. He was the one who played the ghost on stage yesterday. Hearing this, Qi Rong slightly raised his brows. The queen said, Really? Have him come in so I can see his face. Feng Xin can come in too. Thus, Feng Xin and Mu Cheng entered the chamber and knelt before the queen. She took her time looking over Mu Cheng and then said to Shilian, I thought he fought rather well yesterday. A good, courteous child. Looking at his face, you'd think he'd be a gentle minister, but who knew he'd be that tenacious using a saber? Shilian grinned. Right? I think he's really good too. Qi Rong, on the other hand, commented coldly, Oh, the ghost from yesterday was him? Shilian heard his tone and felt dread. Sure enough, the next second, Qi Rong suddenly exploded, snatched that small jade cup from the little tea table and swung it at Mu Cheng's head. Here, your reward, he shouted. Fortunately, Shilian was faster and smacked Qi Rong's hand, forcing him to drop the cup, so the splash didn't make it to Mu Cheng's face. Shilian pulled him back by the collar. Qi Rong, what are you doing? Even whilst being held, Qi Rong was still rampant and raging. Cousin, I'm helping you discipline an impudent servant. Before you made it yesterday, he sure was enjoying himself, taking in all the limelight. Who the f*** do you think you are? The star of the heavenly procession? Are you gonna overthrow the heavens too? The queen was stunned. Wrong. What are you doing? Mu Cheng's face was spared the splash, but his clothes hadn't been. Because the queen hadn't given word, he remained kneeling on the floor, his face grim and pale. Shilian passed Qi Rong to Feng Xin. Don't let him hit anyone. Feng Xin used only one hand to restrain Qi Rong, but Qi Rong was kicking and punching, spitting as he shouted. And who the f*** do you think you are, to have the f***ing nerve to touch me so casually? Shelian could feel his head aching. Qi Rong, you're getting more and more out of control. Then he turned to the Queen. Mother, I forgot to mention something. Please take away his golden carriage. Qi Rong was shocked and yelled, No, no. Why? That was Auntie's birthday gift to me. Even if it was, it must be confiscated, Shelian said. We almost ran into trouble on the streets. Best not to touch it again until you learn how to drive properly. The Queen awed and asked, Trouble? What trouble? Shelian told her the crazy saga of Qi Rong's driving. Qi Rong was furious, his eyes red around the rim. Cousin Crown Prince is wrong. I didn't run into a single person. Shelian snorted. That's because someone stopped you. Qi Rong struggled out of Shelian's hands and ran out of Qifeng Manor in a mad fit, not turning back even when the Queen called out to him. She said sadly, I'll talk to him tomorrow about confiscating his carriage. She sighed. That child had wanted a coach for the longest time, so when his birthday came around, I saw that he was still desperately wanting one, so I gifted it to him. Who knew it'd turn out like this? Had I known, I wouldn't have given it to him. Why must he have a carriage? Shelian wondered. He said it's so that he could go to Mount Tesang any time to bring you home. Shelian fell silent, learning that at the end of the day, it was a gesture of goodwill. After a moment, he spoke. It's better instead to find him a good teacher and to restrain that temper. He can't keep going on like this. The Queen sighed. And what teacher can restrain him? He only ever listens to you. We could hardly have him enter the mountain to go cultivate with you. Besides, the Gosha would die before taking him in as a disciple. Shelian found the idea both hilarious and horrifying and shook his head. With a temper like that, if he should enter the royal holy pavilion, he would raise hell for sure. Both mother and son were deeply troubled by this and couldn't think of any ideas, and so they let it go for the time being. That evening, after having seen his parents and caught up, Shelian rose to leave the palace. Everyone knew that the Crown Prince was deeply obsessed with cultivation, and ever since he had entered the royal holy pavilion, he visited his parents less and less. The king didn't say much on the matter, but the Queen was always reluctant to see him go. After leaving the palace, Shelian casually strolled around the royal capital and accompanied Mu Ching to make his visit home, as he suggested the day before. The opulent, tall red gates and the impoverished slums were a street away from each other. Mu Ching's home was situated in a dark alley of the most bustling area of the royal capital. The three of them had just turned into the alley when 5 or 6 children in rags surrounded them, calling out, Gurgur, Gurgur is back. Shelian was confused at first, wondering why they would call strangers Gurgur. But then he discovered that the Gurgur they were calling wasn't him, but Mu Ching. The children called out to him sweetly, but Mu Ching ignored them. There's nothing this time. Don't call me anything. His face was wooden, but his voice wasn't cold. He turned to Shelian. Don't mind them, Your Highness. They're just kids from the block. However, that group of children was obviously very comfortable around him, having grown up playing together, and they weren't afraid of him at all. They giggled and surrounded them, their dirty little hands extended, begging for munchies from Mu Ching. Finally, Mu Ching reached for the gem-like cherries in his bag and handed them out. Feng Xin was astonished seeing this, as if Mu Ching doing anything of the sort was a miracle. After all, Mu Ching had a pretty boy face that looked extremely selfish and cold-hearted, the type that, despite seeing someone die from starvation on the streets, would still keep a tight hold on his own food. Shelian, on the other hand, wasn't surprised at all. At first, he had also wanted to find something to give to the children, but he usually didn't carry sweets on his person, and having Feng Xin give coins was too much like dismissing beggars that Shelian didn't think it appropriate. Suddenly, there was a loud galloping noise coming from the main streets, the long shrieking whinny of a horse, and people screaming. The three of them stopped, and then Shelian rushed out of the alley. All around the main street was chaos. Stores toppled and people on the ground. The pedestrians were all running to get away. Apples and pears rolled all over. He hadn't figured out what was happening when he heard the crazed laughter of a young man. "Out of my way! Get out of my way! I don't give a shit if any of you get trampled." Feng Xin swore. "It's Qi Rong again." Sure enough, Qi Rong stood atop that glamorous golden coach, his expression malicious, lashing his whip wildly, the white horse howling from the welting. "Stop him!" Shelian shouted. That golden carriage rushed by them, and Feng Xin acknowledged, understood, and charged on ahead. Shelian was about to go check for any wounded from all the toppled stalls and knocked over pedestrians left behind Qi Rong's mad trail, when suddenly he noticed something wrong. He whipped his head around and saw that just behind that large golden coach, something was being dragged along with a thick, long hemp rope. At the end of the rope was a gunny sack, and in that sack there seemed to be something struggling. It looked like there was a person in that sack. That moment, Shelian could only feel his blood run cold. The next second, he rushed forward. From all the whipping, that white horse was dashing like it was running for its life, spinning the wheels of that carriage furiously. Feng Xin went to hold the horse back, but probably wouldn't be able to stop it immediately. Shelian raced up to the carriage in only a few steps, unsheathed his sword, and struck down. That rope snapped in two, and that gunny sack dropped to the ground, rolled, and came to a stop. Shelian bent forward to inspect it. The gunny sack had been dragged for who knows how long, and was ripped from all the scraping. It was extremely dirty, covered in blood, looking like a dead body bag. Another swing from his sword, and the rope tied around the opening was cut. He opened the bag and looked, and there was indeed something inside. What's more, it was a young child. Shelian ripped open that entire sack. The young child within was curled into a ball, hugging his head tightly. His filthy clothes were covered either in giant footprints or fresh blood. Even his hair was tangled with blood. He was a mess, and it was obvious that he had been heavily beaten by someone. So much so that he didn't even look human anymore. Judging by his size, he was only 7 or 8, a very small creature, shaking as if a layer of his skin had been forcibly peeled off. Truly incredible that he was still alive after such a violent beating. Shelian reached out a hand to feel his neck and found that his pulse wasn't too weak, and sighed a breath of relief. He immediately picked up the small body, turned around, and yelled, enraged, "Feng Xin, arrest Qi Rong." He couldn't believe that something like this could happen in the kingdom of Shenle. In the light of day, on the main street, a member of the nobility stuffed a live human in a gunny sack to be dragged behind a horse carriage. If he hadn't seen and stopped it, the small child would have been dragged to death that day. Some distance away came the sounds of whinnying and the angry roars of Qi Rong, and soon after, Feng Xin yelled back, "He's been stopped." Shelian rushed toward them, just in time to hear Qi Rong howl in rage. "You f***ing lowly servant, dare hurt me. Who gave you the balls?" It turns out Feng Xin couldn't stop him, so he tried to snatch the reins away from him instead. Of course, Qi Rong wouldn't let him, so the two pulled back and forth. And in a moment of carelessness, Feng Xin bumped and pushed him off the carriage. He fell to the ground and rolled a few times, his knees scraped. Seeing that he was surrounded by bystanders, he felt nothing but rage and embarrassment. However, Shilian cut in. "I did," he said. Qi Rong opened and closed his mouth a couple of times before finally crying. "Cousin, Crown Prince," Shilian said angrily, "look at what you've done. Qi Rong, I really—" Just then, he suddenly felt the child in his arms twitch, seeming to have loosened the hands hugging his head, and was peeking at him from the gap between his elbows. Shilian immediately restrained his anger and lowered his head to soothe the child in a gentle voice. "How do you feel? Do you feel pain anywhere?" That child was amazingly still conscious. He hadn't fainted from pain, and he hadn't frozen in shock. He shook his head. Shilian saw that half of his bloody little face poked out and was about to check for other head injuries, but that child firmly covered the other half of his face with his hands, stubbornly refusing to show him.